Okay, so I hope you still have a little bit of energy left. I'd like to invite all of the speakers up to the front, and we'll have our final session, which is a panel discussion. So in this part, we get a chance to sort of think across the day and maybe ask, yeah, please come and sit, and think about questions that might go across the different talks, maybe more general questions, but also you can ask specific questions if you didn't get a chance to, or you thought of something that you want to ask the panel in the meantime. So we can start by actually, if the panel have questions for each other. I'm putting you on the spot here. So I'll blab for a second while you think about that. But yeah, so just thinking across the day, there's a lot of overlap, but a lot of different methods, a lot of different approaches, a lot of different theoretical questions. So what are your questions for each other? Oh, and Devin's here too. So you can ask. He's actually up there, but yeah. He's everywhere. Yeah.
I have a question for Barbara. Oh, I forgot. I have my mic on.
You can still use that.
I'm curious about your new NICU study. That sounds really interesting. So what kind of outcome are you looking at? Like, what health outcome is it related to? Because there's so many possibilities.
Yeah, so we have different measures. It's all with so Saha, Mogimi, and Amia, and then Laurel too. So we have the measures at birth, and then after the intervention, and then when they come back. So it changes a bit over time. So at the beginning, it's just it's the EEG measurements for different types of paradigms that Laurel had established for all their kids, like simple and complex meter, or then even priming of different meters, and how see what it builds on work that Saha and Laurel are doing right now to see what is already. If you test just premature babies, what rhythm capacities do they already show? And so we want to see how it changes over time, and then later when they become older, then add also some rhythm perception and production measures, either just moving to the music and then film the babies when they're and see whether the Sentner method can extend to, now it's out, to earlier age, or then add later on then some pre-verbal communication measures, so descriptions, or then social behavior when they are then 18-month-olds, like what Laurel did earlier, right? So yeah, when you talk about the study, and then when you had the premature, the gene expression at one point, so that might be a link too that it's interesting to look at, right? From the weight.
Yeah, just to add to that, I made a note on my computer when you said that few sentences about the premature brain development, and that you can measure, that aspect in the GWAS. That would be amazing. Like, we have a fairly small sample. We can talk afterwards about whether it's feasible, but it would add an amazing dimension to the work that we're doing. Yeah, yeah.
I have a question that's maybe for everybody, but I was thinking about it, Barbara, in your first talk. I know that often, I guess this is about diversity of samples and sort of etiology of where different speech language disorders. This feels really loud, and my voice feels very low. I feel very serious. It's okay? All right. So there was some interesting a paper that came out on dyslexia last week from Rachel Romero's lab, looking at the sort of, we often think about, phonological awareness being so incredibly important for dyslexia, for example, and they were sort of replicating that in their high SES samples, which of course is what the vast majority of research tests, but that in low SES samples that actually their reading skills seem to be more related to some other traits like rapid naming and things like that. So I guess I was curious, beyond controlling for SES in samples, are there ways that you think rhythm would relate across other different phenotypic aspects of the speech language disorders or dyslexia in particular? Do we think it's specifically associated with specific, language phenotypes? Is it just going to, like, not just when we think about the disorder, but when we think about the components that are going into that and how that maybe relates to the sort of etiology of these kind of heterogeneous disorders, but that we've given specific names for diagnostic purposes? No one understood the question?
Well,
Oh, you have a
I have my mic. So maybe, but I think more like exploratory work, sort of pitting multiple possibilities against each other rather than trying to look at like just one subset with one potential explanation, because of the heterogeneity, and the heterogeneity could be like messy biology that we don't understand yet. So
Are you seeing that rhythm is particularly related to certain aspects of the other dimensionalities of the disorders? Or we don't know
not
yet?
yet. I mean,
Okay.
that's what's interesting and funny, is that like it seems to be related to multiple different aspects of language, like many different language tasks and multiple different speech and language disorders. I think though with stuttering and the internal beat generation, I mean, I think Devin could speak to that. But stuttering is a different sort of, the clinical profile also is quite different. Whereas dyslexia and DLD, have some more overlap in terms of how they present clinically.
Thanks.
I maybe wanted to try to chime in at this question. So I think one of the challenges here is that rhythm isn't a unidimensional construct. So there are many different aspects of rhythm perception. I think one of the challenges is that some of the tasks, like rhythm discrimination tasks that are used to assess sort of rhythm perception and then look at relationships to language, it's possible that people can do those tasks in different ways. So a change in like swapping a pair of intervals in a rhythm may alter the grouping. And so people can make a rhythm discrimination judgment based on a change in perceived grouping, or they may actually be comparing intervals versus locking onto the beat and making judgments based on deviations from expected timing of events. So I think there's multiple ways that people can make rhythm discrimination judgments that may reflect different aspects of rhythm perception. And so thinking of it as a unidimensional construct and showing its relationship to these different language disorders, I think it's going to be important to get a more fine-grained look at actually what the differences actually are in each of these different disorders.
Can I just ask a question for Devin? Beyond the rhythm discrimination task work, did you use other tasks, tapping into a beat synchronization or rhythm imitation tasks, or would you predict other deficit patterns? Or
so I think this is a challenge. I think one of the most problematic tasks actually is the sort of synchronized continued tapping task, because that just has a very isochronous structure to it. So you could be not necessarily generating an internal beat to synchronize to those sequences, but more reproducing a sequence of intervals. I can sort of looking at the debate between sort of beat-based and interval-based mechanisms. I think one place that you might, and the data in stuttering has been very mixed on sync continue tasks, where there's not strong evidence for any kind of increased variability in stuttering for a sync continue task that's consistent across studies. I think when you start getting to slow rhythms where you have to then maybe use subdivision or something like that to help you synchronize, that you might actually start to see bigger differences. And I think doing more work probing really slow rhythms can help us get at sort of this idea of having to maintain a beat in your mind.
Right. So just to summarize a little bit.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and the genetic studies where you use such a simple measure, it's amazing what you get, I think. You know, I mean, that's the positive spin on it. The challenge is to take what Devin's saying into the genetic studies, because that would really be a challenge to get 600,000 people to do these different tests. Yeah, so maybe at this point we'll open it up for the audience to make. Isabel, I think you were going to make a comment.
Should I?
Well, you tackled so important issues, and you know it: language, music, rhythm, deficits. I mean, genetics, everything. I mean, we didn't talk so much about neural correlates, but the brain was not that there. But we know there is a lot of work on this, and you know also my biases, and so I was kind of reflecting that we are correlating everything with everything here. And at some point I was thinking, okay, and I agree completely with the point that among the processes that contribute to beat processing, but think about language, like we had syntax, we had phonology, we have reading, which is visual. I mean, everything seems to be so simple, but it's not. It's extremely complex, and we correlate all this. So I have a worry that by focusing on correlation, overlaps, and we miss the point somewhere, because I do believe they are distinct processes. Music is not language. And so I'd like to have your point of view, or perspective of how can you tackle from the different angles the idea that you could tap something that is not the right factor, because correlations are what they are.
I can try to answer that, yeah. So I think, yes, this is a concern also. And then a lot of whether we see a correlation or not, or it often depends on the sample size, right? So if we start to interrogate things in really large sample sizes, we often see a lot of correlations. So I think that there's then different sanity checks we can do, sensitivity analyses where we exclude a subset of participants that could or may or may not be confounding the results, but that gives us the opportunity, or we can covary some other traits. So what's cool, I think, about some of the genetic analysis methods is that now that we can integrate data from separate samples in so many ways, and I talked about it a little, how we covaried for nonverbal IQ even though it wasn't measured in that sample, but we're able to subtract it out. We can look at correlations. We can control for a polygenic score, so we can get the polygenic score for one trait and then control for the polygenic score for another trait. So we can start, basically each of these studies then generates a further hypothesis to be able to try to disentangle things using other types of data. So that I think that will prevent some of the smearing, but I think also biologically, there are many biological functions that are shared among things that present as phenotypically distinct, shared or common, because of, it's just, I don't know why, but it's, so genes do, there are genes that have, many functions, right, or influence many phenotypes. Yeah, the brain, right, exactly. Right, there's only one. Right, but so there could be evolutionary reasons. I mean, I think this is where it starts to get interesting to try to start to test some of the evolutionary theories, and it also depends on what the goal is. So is the goal to improve, is the goal to do a treatment? Is the goal to use us to, develop some screening tools to increase identification? Is the goal to get at a neural or cognitive mechanism? So I feel like it's okay if different studies have different goals. I think that power is a big deal. So we should constantly be coming back to are we powered enough, and are we ascertaining in a way, are we recruiting in a way are we saying, come be in my music study, and then we get people who are motivated about music, and then we've excluded people whose brains are wired a little differently and that aren't as interested in music, right? So things like that, or come be in my language study, right? And so sometimes we handle this by being vague about what our studies are about, but it's to the public when we're recruiting. But I just think in general, you want to think, how are people ascertained? Are there key like subpopulations that are being left out of studies? Like you had mentioned about like children with dyslexia from lower SCS, like are often just not in the studies because it's maybe harder to reach them for a number of reasons. And so I think if we just keep re-examining the assumptions of each study, then we can try, start to disentangle. And when results replicate across many, when we're able to test them in many independent samples that are all well-powered, that does, I think, help us and help, again, to avoid some of the smearing. But it won't always tell us the mechanism, but then it depends on what the goal is, right? So there's some treatments that work without us knowing the mechanism, or screening methods that work without us knowing the mechanism. That can still be valuable in some cases. It just doesn't satisfy all of our scientific curiosity. But it can generate new hypotheses to test about causality, right? So it's sort of this iterative thing, hamster wheel.
Does anyone else want to comment?
I mean, I guess I don't think this is foreign to this audience, but I think it also speaks to the importance of having a good theoretical framework before we launch into things. And so, like Raina, in your talk, I thought it was so lovely how you kind of could present these frameworks and what are the hypotheses. And I know, like Ani Patel is like so well known in our field for doing this. And then you can get some really testable hypotheses to look at to help sure that you're doing things in a way that kind of has theoretical plausibility as well. I always tell my students to do like the common sense check with their data first, right? Like, and so, I mean, that's kind of silly, but I think that speaks to some of those types of arguments. And I think we can set up, foils in certain ways too, to try to test those issues and make sure that we're, kind of not just going for the kitchen sink in that regard.
So other, yes.
Hello. So I guess one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about too, I guess sort of related to Isabel's question too, is that, there are rhythms in music, and music is so good at, getting us to synchronize and move, but there are so many other things around us that have rhythm too, and so this is a general question, it'll look different for each of you. But how much of what you guys have been talking about today do you feel like is specific to music? So the relationships between music and language that we're finding, or we're talking about rhythm, but are some of the things, and again, looks different for each of you, but do you think that the things you're finding are specific to the music domain, or is this general for all rhythms? For instance, in the priming work, do you think if you did something in some sort of environmental sounds or in visual walking and you had a rhythm, does that prime in the same way? So these sorts of questions of just trying to ask, is it specific to music? Yeah.
Obviously, I don't have data for your example, right? Yeah, no. I think with the material we went for, so you have the music, you have the regular underlying pulse, but in addition, you have a metric hierarchy, right? So one thing that we wanted to test now is, so what is if we go away from the music and we just already use an isochronous tone sequence, where you have a regularity, you can impose a hierarchy, but not necessarily. I took walking footsteps, I have a regularity. It could be close to this idea of isochronous or a metronome. So what will be interesting, and what would be my hypothesis, is that there's an advantage of having the musical structure in addition, because if you have multiple hierarchies, that they multiple regularities at a different hierarchical level that together reinforce the structure at multiple time spans and multiple time levels, could lead to stronger temporal predictions at different time spans, and has then an advantage for the processing of, for example, in the rhythmic priming paradigm afterwards. So Murray Rhys-Jones called it metric binding. So you have the different oscillators together, and then they bind, and then you have the predictions, the temporal predictions that are strengthened. I also say this because, for example, we did not studies with language, but we did implicit learning paradigm studies, where we compared where we studied artificial grammar, so implemented with tone sequences. And if you implement it with a regular, strongly metrical structure in comparison to an irregular one, well, you learn better the tone sequence grammar with the regular than with the irregular. And when you then compare a strongly metrical structure that is implemented in the tone sequences, so you don't learn the temporal structure, you learn the tone grammar. You have an advantage if you have the metrical structure in comparison to just an isochronous tone presentation. So that's one example where you can get a sense of a benefit to not only have one regularity at one level, like an isochronous tone sequence or footsteps or something, but an additional benefit from the metric hierarchy. So that would be my hypothesis, but now obviously we have to test it, how it carries over for the language paradigm, for example.
Right. I mean, I could, in my mind, I've sort of shifted from thinking of specificity to thinking about things that are common, but I think like there's probably not a lot that's like hyper specific to music, but that applies to communication in many modalities.
Yeah, I think another kind of way of flipping your question is like you're asking when is it music, and then I think that gets into our question of like, well, what is music and when is, you know what I mean, like are they environmental sounds, or at some point you know, is it you know, Gershwin, you know, in Paris, and you're just like, oh yeah, it's the city sounds, but it's music as well, right? So like some of that, and I think we struggle with that, and I know you've done a lot of work in like the infant-directed realm. There's some things where you're like, oh, that's definitely infant-directed speech, and then sometimes you're like, that's definitely infant-directed singing, and sometimes you're like, both, like they're, you know, like it's not quite a song, but it's definitely more rhythmic than speech, and it's definitely, and so I think some of these things do kind of exist along a continuum. I think in a lot of the paradigms that I'm working with, I also think about like, is this social and is this ecologically valid? And I think those are a lot of the maybe ways of framing that when I'm thinking about, you know, why are children responding or engaging in certain ways, and thinking about, you know, is this a stimuli that is going to have some meaningful reward value for them, and why? There could be different aspects of it. And then when we experimentally manipulate things, I think you have to get careful, because then you can get into like, oh, they're not responding the same way because we've, you know, ablated the rhythmic structure. Or you can be like, because it's weird and they never hear anything like that in nature ever. So I think we have to kind of weigh those contrasts to have good experimental controls, but also think about, well, what is the kind of take-home and relevance and sort of ecological validity that I can get from this paradigm.
Devin, did you want to comment?
Yes, I want to just chime in and add a couple thoughts. So in some ways, I think of, I certainly think of rhythm more generally, not specific to music. Music is, in my view, sort of an excellent stimulus, but that reflects sort of the kinds of temporal structures that are in the world more generally, in a variety of different domains. And I think one important link for me is the link between how rhythms in the environment can structure and guide attention and time. And music affords a way of probing that in some instances. And so studying those kinds of mechanisms actually informs more generally how our attentional systems are entrained by rhythmic structure in the environment.
Yeah, and I might use my prerogative as chairing this, just to add a couple comments. So we haven't talked much about prediction today, but I mean, rhythms I think are so powerful because they predict when we expect things to happen in the future. So in that sense, they're a very general mechanism, not just related to music. And so if I think as a developmental psychologist, it would seem to me that rhythms and timing are going to be important for basically brain development. It's hard to imagine developing a brain that doesn't have some kind of timing and expectation sort of built in from the beginning. Music might add something on top of that. So there might be some things like maybe meters and so on that are enhanced with music, but I suspect that the basic idea of temporal regularity is really fundamental, and that I think is maybe why in Raina's data it's showing up as being related to so many things, because if that's the basis of brain development, it's going to affect a lot of future things that brain can do. So are there any other questions? Yes.
For the study on stuttering and rhythm deficits, I'm not sure if I missed it, but I'm just curious on children and or adults that stutter, like, do they perceive rhythm differently? Like, for example, if you were to analyze their speech rhythm and have them produce speech according to the timing of the analyzed rhythm, would they be able to copy the rhythm because it's their own internal rhythm, rather than rhythm production against a metronome?
That's a great question. So I maybe answer it in two parts. So we have evidence that some evidence that they do perceive rhythm differently, or at least have particular challenges with particular types of rhythms where they have to fill in a beat within their minds to help them make an accurate discrimination judgment. So there, I think, some evidence that there are some aspects of rhythm perception that may be different. With adults who stutter, I think adults who stutter have had opportunity to develop their chronic stutterers who had opportunity to develop compensatory strategies. And I think there are different ways that one can make rhythm comparisons. And so we have some fMRI evidence that there may be a shift to more interval by interval comparisons of rhythms in adults who stutter that then enables them to make a rhythm discrimination judgment, but they may be doing it in a different way. But I think that's a little bit of evidence. I think much more is needed. And so the second part of your question was about speech rhythm. And so there's, I think, I think that's a more challenging question to know if they're perceiving speech rhythm differently, if I track that question correctly. We're in the process of actually a collaborative grant with Emily Garnett at the University of Michigan, where we're using the spontaneous speech synchronization task developed by Asanio and colleagues which has participants produce like a whispered sound while they're actually having to make a judgment about a syllable sequence, and they're looking at to what extent people spontaneously synchronize their speech with the produced speech with what they're listening to. And they found a bimodal distribution of sort of phase locking values in response to this task. And so we're looking at now adults who do and do not stutter on this task. And so the jury is out in terms of whether we're seeing sort of characteristic differences in speech synchronization. So I'm not completely sure I answered that in its entirety.
Thank you.
Do you guys have anything else you want to say? Okay, so I think we're out of time. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming out, for your all your wonderful posters and your questions and all the discussions that went on today. It was a great day. It's not over though, so I hope you have a good dinner, and I hope to see at least most of you back to the lecture and concert at 8 o'clock tonight. Until tonight, and then if you're not coming, until next year. Okay.